The city of Petersburg, Virginia, witnessed the dawn of January 1st, 1870. An abandoned Confederate military ward loomed just outside the borders of Richmond. Rough timber structures framed pitch-black chambers. Raw waste festered without any proper sanitation. Inmates consumed their meager rations locked inside tiny cages, devoid of any communal eating area. Flickering oil lanterns offered the solitary source of illumination. They named this bleak compound Howard's Grove, completely unaware it would soon forge a terrifying new path in the annals of American history. It became the premier mental institution across the United States, designed strictly for African Americans. However, this narrative holds absolutely no trace of human advancement. This remains a chilling chronicle of absolute dominance. Major General Edward Kemey, acting as the commanding authority over Virginia, abruptly decreed General Order 136. Officials mandated the immediate relocation of all black inmates housed within the Eastern Lunatic Asylum of Williamsburg directly to these very grounds. Authorities ordered the forced extraction of every African American imprisoned for madness throughout the entire Commonwealth, condemning them to this specific compound. Physicians offered a deeply sinister justification, blaming liberation itself. Medical professionals argued that newly freed individuals lacked the mental capacity to survive independence. They genuinely proclaimed that the mere act of emancipation shattered the human mind. Over the next 15 years, the government funneled $15,000 into acquiring a 300-acre plantation property in Dinwiddie County. Laborers erected a colossal red brick fortress. Wardens packed the halls with thousands of captives, enforcing strict racial divides for almost 100 agonizing years. The Central State Hospital represented merely a single gear, grinding within a monstrous apparatus stretching across the entire American landscape. Between the 1770s and the 1970s, hundreds of psychiatric fortresses erupted from the soil. Society guaranteed profound psychological healing. Experts swore to bring sweeping medical reform. Society pledged a compassionate path forward for shattered minds. Yet the grim reality they produced was profoundly sinister. The Athens Lunatic Asylum emerged in Ohio during 1874, initially holding 572 beds. By the 1950s, wardens had stuffed more than 1,800 suffering souls inside. A patient named Margaret Schilling vanished without a trace for 42 silent days. Searchers finally discovered her rotting corpse locked inside a desolate wing, where her decomposing flesh etched a permanent shadow into the cold cement. That macabre silhouette haunts the floorboards to this very day. Meanwhile, in New Jersey, the Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital expanded into the most massive continuous structure spanning the entire nation. The legendary folk musician Woody Guthrie endured his ultimate agonizing years trapped within those walls. He deteriorated painfully from Huntington's disease, occasionally receiving visits from Bob Dylan, who absorbed his musical legacy amidst the sorrow. New York established Letchworth Village as a massive disposal site for youth labeled socially defective. During 1950, merciless physicians transformed these vulnerable children into human guinea pigs to test an experimental polio vaccine. The oblivious public remained completely in the dark. Down in Virginia, a physician named Walter Freeman roamed between various clinics, executing countless brutal lobotomies. The surgeon routinely shoved a sharp metal ice pick deep past the delicate human eye socket. He hammered the steel blind with a wooden mallet, violently severing crucial neurological pathways. This man managed 25 identical mutilations within a single afternoon. The medical community lauded this butchery as profound progress. A dark thread connected all these ominous facilities. Severe congestion, skeletal staffing, barbaric therapies, and forced inmate servitude yielded millions of dollars in illicit agricultural revenue. Sprawling graveyards overflowed with completely nameless, forgotten resting places. Thousands of discarded humans decayed beneath simple numbered rocks, abandoned forever by blood relatives too humiliated to retrieve their remains. How did this supposedly civilized nation engineer an apparatus seemingly meant to cure, yet strictly optimized to imprison? What sinister forces caused African American inmates to receive severe psychiatric diagnoses at frequencies 3 times higher than any other demographic on Earth? What horrific fates befell the countless innocent children who crossed those thresholds only to vanish forever? Furthermore, why did humanity wait over 200 years to finally interrogate these atrocities? The absolute truth lingers, buried within the decaying archives. Investigators uncovered over 800,000 pages of fragile paper, 36,000 haunting photographs, and intake files explicitly citing liberation as a primary trigger for madness. Grim clinical ledgers meticulously track involuntary sterilizations, while chilling autopsy findings expose the ultimate bloody price of state-sponsored custody. We now unearth the deeply suppressed legacy of American madhouses, exposing these brutal storage facilities built for the unwanted. These shadowed corners absorb the broken souls society desperately desired to erase. Step into the abyss with Dark Histories Television. Our current investigation tears away the veil covering America's psychiatric wards, exposing how absolute domination, profound apathy, and deafening silence destroyed infinite lives. Join our investigating community by subscribing to this channel and drop a comment detailing your current location. Your vital engagement guarantees these forgotten voices will never be silenced again. The descent commences now. Chapter 1 covers the genesis of the American Asylum Network, stretching from 1773 until 1860. Our horrific saga originates deep within Williamsburg, Virginia. The calendar marks 1773. Royal British Governor Francis Fire faces a mounting crisis. Deranged souls roam aimlessly through the cobblestone avenues of his pristine settlement. Unlike the motherland of England, which already operates grim fortresses for the disturbed, the Virginia territory lacks any designated cages to hide them away. Through sheer political will, the governor manipulates the colonial assembly into financing a brutal, permanent resolution. Upon the 12th of October, 1773, the public hospital for persons of insane and disordered minds finally unbarred its heavy gates. This bleak structure represented the very first government-funded psychological prison on American soil. Its terrifying foundations would establish a dark, unbreakable blueprint for every nightmare that eventually followed. The compound appeared deceptively simple, comprising a 2-story brick facade capable of holding roughly 24 captives. Their methodology remained flawlessly cruel. They simply eradicated the mad from public sight. Wardens locked them in shadow. Guards merely waited for death to naturally intervene. By contemporary standards, their medical interventions bordered on sheer barbarism. Desperate victims suffered bound in heavy iron chains and forged manacles. Physicians subjected them to horrific bloodletting and violent purges. Screaming inmates were repeatedly submerged beneath freezing, breathless waters. Healing was never the objective. Total psychological domination was the true prize. For the initial 60 years of operation, this Virginian nightmare strictly imprisoned only Caucasian individuals. The concept of psychological suffering among captives never even registers. Bonded human beings remain mere chattel. Masters hold absolute authority over their breathing assets. Should a captive exhibit symptoms of psychological fracture, the master handles the crisis in absolute secrecy. Government authorities look the other way completely. Such indifference breeds a ruthless calculus. Whenever people of color manifest severe psychological anguish, their captors face a grim shortage of choices. Plantation masters might quietly auction the suffering soul away. Alternatively, they could imprison the broken individual deep within the estate. Savage lashings serve as the primary tool to force obedience. However, dispatching these traumatized minds to state asylums remains absolutely forbidden by law. A sparse handful of these broken captives do eventually vanish inside private, independent sanitariums. By 1848, Virginia law permits bonded individuals to enter exclusive psychiatric facilities, provided the masters cover the exorbitant treatment fees. However, this financial burden proves astronomical. Countless slaveholders simply refuse to pay, while Caucasian residents permanently dominate the waitlists. Amidst this systemic cruelty, a deeply bizarre medical hypothesis begins to take root. Dr. Samuel Cartwright, a medical practitioner from Louisiana, releases a paper in 1851 detailing a fabricated affliction he dubs drapetomania. He presents this as a profound psychiatric defect, an uncontrollable compulsion that supposedly drives subjugated individuals to flee their captivity. His prescribed remedy dictates treating these captive adults like ignorant infants, administering savage floggings whenever deemed necessary. Modern society finds this hypothesis utterly grotesque, yet the antebellum South embraces the horrific doctrine as absolute gospel. This sinister perspective lays a toxic foundation for American psychiatry over the coming century. Caucasian physicians arrogantly presume that minorities entirely lack the biological capacity for typical psychological breakdowns. Medical elites convince themselves that lifelong servitude actually shields the human mind from genuine emotional collapse. A primitive existence, unyielding daily schedules, and a total lack of autonomy. These bleak conditions allegedly protect captive brains from the heavy modern burdens that drive civilized men to madness. This chilling diagnostic presumption breeds catastrophic generational outcomes. Whenever a captive genuinely exhibits psychological deterioration, clinicians immediately cite the distress as undeniable evidence of genetic weakness. They are never considered medically ill. They are forever branded biologically flawed. Experts declare their primitive brains wholly inadequate for navigating the intricate, overwhelming demands of sophisticated society. Farther north, a powerful wave of social transformation silently gathers an unstoppable momentum. Dorothea Dix, a humble educator hailing from Massachusetts, commences a grueling inspection of prisons and poorhouses in 1841. She discovers psychotic individuals shackled within subterranean dungeons, trapped inside iron pens, battered with sticks, and abandoned completely bare in freezing cells. Dix ignites a fierce moral crusade. She journeys tirelessly across every single territory. She delivers harrowing testimonies before stunned state lawmakers. She fiercely demands extracting the deranged from penitentiaries and slums, relocating them into proper healing sanctuaries. Her relentless legislative campaign achieves breathtaking success. Between 1843 and 1880, more than 30 territories established civic psychiatric wards directly mirroring her visionary blueprints. However, this righteous crusade harbors a deeply tragic side effect. The newly minted hospitals suddenly require a concrete clinical validation. Physicians frantically construct complicated hypotheses regarding the true origins of madness. They quickly pinpoint flawed heredity as the ultimate culprit. Academics systematically brand specific demographics as inherently vulnerable to lunacy. They invent broad clinical diagnostic categories, granting themselves terrifying discretion to lock away virtually anyone. The dark stage is irrevocably set for the coming nightmare. A system born from pure humanitarian empathy mutates into an unrecognizable monstrosity. It morphs into a ruthless engine of social subjugation. It becomes a sterile, highly effective method for erasing unwanted souls from the public eye. This vast web of concrete fortresses will eventually cage hundreds of thousands of everyday Americans behind impenetrable, deadbolted doors. Approaching 1860, the grim national pattern is locked in stone. Publicly funded mental asylums now cast long shadows across almost every single territory. Ordinary taxpayers finance these imposing walls. Chief medical wardens command these isolated fiefdoms with terrifying, nearly absolute authority. Wardens possess the horrific ability to detain victims eternally without a single judicial hearing. Furthermore, these massive facilities function in total darkness, permanently shielded from outside public scrutiny. The impending civil war promises to shatter the existing paradigm completely. Millions held in brutal bondage stand on the very precipice of liberation. Caucasian society will soon face a chilling realization regarding the genuine psychological vulnerability of newly freed minorities. Their immediate reaction involves constructing a completely parallel, sinister architecture of confinement. These strictly segregated compounds ensure minority inmates endure vicious racial prejudice, layered violently atop their existing psychological torment. Architects are already drafting blueprints for the inaugural facility of this deeply prejudiced kind. Within a mere 10 years, the infamous Howard's Grove Asylum will unlock its gates in Virginia. The great human warehousing machine prepares for a massive escalation. Chapter 2 uncovers the very first minority sanitarium, spanning the brutal years from 1865 to 1885. The bitter national conflict concludes in April 1865. 4 million subjugated souls suddenly taste emancipation. They possess zero property, zero currency, zero schooling, and absolutely zero judicial safeguards. Moreover, according to the prejudiced medical elite, these survivors inherently lack the cognitive fortitude to endure genuine, independent living. The scientific hierarchy executes a breathtakingly hypocritical pivot almost overnight. Prior to the bloodshed, experts insisted the subjugated were biologically immune to psychological collapse. Now, those same authoritative voices declare the exact opposite. Liberty itself supposedly triggers madness. Emancipated minds, they argue, simply disintegrate under the crushing weight of self-determination. Their delicate psyches allegedly shatter upon contact with true liberty. Unsurprisingly, the clinical evidence supporting this horrific narrative is entirely, maliciously fabricated. Physicians across the ruined South begin diagnosing newly emancipated citizens with catastrophic psychiatric breakdowns at terrifying, unprecedented velocities. Complete schizophrenic breaks, violent hysterical manias, and profound psychotic episodes. The statistics defied all historical precedent. More than 70% of Black individuals confined to Virginian institutions were branded with severe psychological disorders. Contemporary investigators tearing through these dusty archives have uncovered a far darker truth. The medical assessments were a complete lie. Countless souls trapped in these wards suffered from no cognitive defects whatsoever. They simply had no roof over their heads. They were impoverished. They were shattered by unimaginable grief. They were entirely broken by the brutal bloodshed of bondage and civil conflict. Yet, the physicians viewed their agony through a deeply prejudiced filter, legally condemning them to madness. National authorities established the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865 to guide emancipated souls into their new existence. Among its core mandates was the construction of healing sanctuaries and clinical outposts. By 1868, the agency took over a fallen Confederate medical compound known as Howard's Grove, looming just beyond Richmond along the Mechanicsville Turnpike. The compound was a place of absolute misery. Rotting timber structures once housed bleeding rebel combatants. The architecture was profoundly barren, bordering on barbaric. Sanitation infrastructure simply did not exist. Inmates consumed their meager rations, locked inside cages, as communal eating spaces were entirely absent. Flickering kerosene wicks and melting wax provided the only illumination. Such squalor shocked even the lowest standards of that era. Yet the ruling authorities harbored a much more calculating agenda. In the bitter winter of 1869, Major General Edward Coney, the Reconstruction commander of the territory, decreed General Order 136. This sweeping mandate abruptly mutated Howard's Grove into a psychiatric penitentiary designated solely for Black citizens. The directive demanded instantaneous compliance. Every Black individual detained at the Eastern Lunatic Asylum in Williamsburg faced forced relocation to the bleak grounds of Howard's Grove. Any Black citizen rotting in a Virginian dungeon under the guise of madness was systematically hauled to this newly designated compound. The Commonwealth was stripped of all autonomy. Compliance was the absolute ransom required to rejoin the Republic. On the first day of January, 1870, the Dark Migrations commenced. Barely months passed before the compound imprisoned 123 individuals labeled mentally unstable, alongside 100 more written off as destitute paupers. The Central Lunatic Asylum for the Colored Insane was thus wrenched into official existence. The Commonwealth Legislature formally chartered this establishment on the 7th of June, 1870. It stood as the inaugural psychological facility in the nation expressly forged to cage black bodies. The gates remained fiercely racially divided for 98 long years. The environment festering behind those walls was nothing short of horrific. Captives drifted to sleep in locked enclosures. Their days dragged on in absolute idleness. Attendants were terrifyingly scarce and woefully uneducated, providing clinical treatment that was violently inadequate. Yet the fortress executed its true objective flawlessly. It successfully swept those marginalized as unstable from the public thoroughfares of the state. Captive numbers multiplied at a staggering velocity. The decaying structures of Howard's Grove buckled under the sheer volume of human confinement. By 1880, the desperate need for a sprawling, permanent fortress became undeniable. In March 1882, Petersburg acquired a vast 300-acre tract known as Mayfield Farm deep within Dinwiddie County. The territory was bought for exactly $15,000. Municipal leaders handed the acreage over to the Commonwealth to erect a far more massive clinical prison. The agonizing building process dragged on for 3 grueling years. The resurrected Central Lunatic Asylum finally unlocked its heavy doors in the early spring of 1885. It loomed over the landscape as a colossal fortress of crimson brick, heavily imposing in its sprawling Kirkbride design. A towering 4-story central hub housed the overseers, flanking 3-story captive blocks on both sides, with each arm containing 6 distinct confinement zones. This monstrous footprint could easily swallow hundreds of souls. On the 22nd of March, 1885, 373 captives were violently uprooted from Howard's Grove and marched into this new oblivion. Before a single year had completely elapsed, the imprisoned population swelled to 436. A tragic backlog of over 100 more awaited their incarceration. The institution was fundamentally engineered for total self-reliance. Confined inmates were forced to toil across the sprawling agricultural grounds. They bred and slaughtered the livestock. They sowed and harvested the fields. They relentlessly handled the grueling physical labor of structural repairs and endless building projects. Their sweat endlessly funneled wealth directly back into state coffers. It functioned as a ruthless tool for exhaustion and ultimate submission. Dr. William Francis Drury seized the mantle of superintendent in 1896. He would fiercely govern this dark empire for 28 long, unbroken years. Drury emerged as a deeply contradictory overlord. He outwardly condemned tossing the vulnerable into cages or canvas restraints. He championed fresh nutrition, outdoor movement, and the supposed healing power of strenuous labor. He engineered a facade he proudly branded as a warm, domestic sanctuary. Yet beneath this comforting veneer, Drury remained deeply indoctrinated by the violent ideology of white supremacy. He documented grotesque theories, claiming human bondage actually nurtured black individuals by enforcing an uncomplicated existence. He praised its supposed cleanliness and complete isolation from mental strain. He audaciously argued that psychological decay spiked post-emancipation, insisting these freed citizens possessed minds too fragile to bear the heavy burden of liberty. This staggering moral hypocrisy became the very lifeblood of the entire compound. The overseers harbored a chilling conviction that they were delivering mercy, though every ounce of their charity was deeply poisoned by vile prejudice. They medicated surface behaviors while aggressively upholding the exact societal chains generating the trauma. They dispensed medicine with one hand, violently stripping away basic human dignity with the other. By 1894, the state legislature rebranded the grim enclosure as the Central State Hospital. The derogatory label of madness was scrubbed away to project a modernized, compassionate illusion. Yet the harrowing reality bleeding within those brick walls remained completely, utterly stagnant. The masses locked inside just kept swelling. 849 souls vanished there by 1897. 1,730 were swallowed by 1915. The fortress was finally achieving its true, insidious destiny. It had become a sprawling, inescapable warehouse for marginalized citizens, systematically deemed too broken to exist within society. Chapter 3. The Kirkbride Dream, from 1845 to 1900. While Central State rose from Virginia soil, a quiet revolution in psychiatric architecture swept the nation. The visionary was Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride. His concepts shaped nearly every major psychiatric facility built between 1845 and 1910. Kirkbride served as the absolute ruler at the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane in Philadelphia. He controlled the institution for 43 long years. Throughout those dark decades, he forged a meticulous philosophy, detailing exactly how these sanctuaries should be physically structured and strictly governed. This imposing psychological doctrine was officially known as moral treatment. He firmly believed shattered minds could be healed through perfect surroundings. He demanded pristine landscapes, unpolluted air, abundant sunlight, rigid schedules, and purposeful labor. Such harmony supposedly mended the fractured psyche. The physical architecture was absolutely essential. He engineered a highly specific, calculated layout that would forever bear his dark legacy as the Kirkbride Plan. The structure featured a linear administrative core flanked by two sprawling wings. From the sky above, it resembled a massive bat stretching its dark wings. This chilling symmetry served a cold purpose. Inmates were sorted by madness and gender, keeping the quietest souls safely near the heart of the complex. The violently insane were banished to the absolute farthest reaches of those cavernous corridors. This strict segregation controlled the chaotic masses and allowed for earned freedoms as minds stabilized. Every single cell possessed a window. The towering wards were deliberately staggered to capture blinding natural light. The exterior boasted manicured forests, blooming gardens, and winding trails. The ultimate objective was to manifest a peaceful sanctuary where deep psychological wounds might organically close. During 1854, Kirkbride released a definitive book detailing asylum construction and rigid internal organization. It covered general hospital arrangements for the insane. This heavy volume quickly became the absolute gospel for psychiatric architecture. Lawmakers nationwide adopted this dark blueprint. Ohio initiated plans for a massive new sanctuary in its southeastern territory during 1867. The state commissioned a remarkably young, ambitious designer named Levi Tucker Schofield for the grim task. At merely 26 years of age, he possessed a staggering resume. The Civil War veteran formerly served as chief engineer for the future Ohio governor. Schofield drafted the sprawling Athens lunatic asylum, strictly adhering to the rigid doctrines laid out by Kirkbride. This massive four-story building ran 853 by 60 feet, housing 544 rooms. It held 572 inmates, though the doctor advised half. Building commenced in 1868. Heavy bricks were baked directly on the property using native earth. The ominous landscapes were plotted by Herman Helen, a prodigy of the brilliant mind who engineered Central Park. Every meticulously crafted element was supposed to cure the broken human mind. Athens Lunatic Asylum unlocked its heavy doors on January 9, 1874. The very first admission was a 14-year-old epileptic girl. Her terrified family genuinely believed dark demonic forces consumed her soul. They abandoned her at the fortress, in desperate search of salvation. Identical monoliths shadowed the American landscape during this dark era. Western State Hospital in Virginia and Eastern State in Williamsburg emerged. Greystone Park in New Jersey and Danvers State in Massachusetts all blindly followed this exact architectural gospel. Every grand facility promised a revolutionary dawn for psychiatric salvation. Yet the grim reality brutally crushed that fragile dream. These massive complexes bled money during construction and daily upkeep. Politicians eagerly erected colossal monuments, but utterly refused to pay for vital caregivers. These beautifully deceptive prisons swelled with excessive human cargo almost the moment their heavy doors swung open. The captive demographics deeply shocked optimistic reformers. Countless souls trapped within these thick walls suffered no genuine madness whatsoever. They were merely discarded elders abandoned by exhausted relatives. They were tragic alcoholics. They were unfortunates, cursed with seizures. They were devastated mothers, drowning in postpartum shadows. They were broken soldiers, haunted by severe combat trauma. The chilling admission ledgers from Athens whisper a horrifying truth. Bizarre early triggers for clinical insanity included self-pleasure. Diagnoses included heavy drinking, religious fanaticism, poor health, life changes, childbirth complications. They recorded menstrual distress and simple epilepsy. 82 humans were locked away for masturbation, including 81 men. This complex system demanded many healers. Moral therapy relied on intimate connection. Inmates required intense supervision, pure guidance, and deep compassion. Yet these grim fortresses remained permanently understaffed. Guards received pathetic wages and zero psychological training. Enforcers earned their badges purely through raw muscle rather than intellect. As the 19th century died, the brilliant psychological dream died with it. The majestic architectural shells continued to tower over the landscape. However, the hidden reality inside rotted into pure institutional nightmare. Suffocating congestion reached highly critical levels. The noble concept of medical healing completely surrendered to cold, brutal imprisonment. True psychological salvation was entirely replaced by harsh physical containment. Yet this tragic era birthed some of the most hauntingly magnificent structures in all of American history. Many of these silent brick monsters remain standing today. Today, these rotting structures sit empty or repurposed. They stand as chilling gravestones to a disastrous medical illusion. They prove that noble motives rarely prevent catastrophic tragedies. The upcoming chapter, however, descended into absolute pitch blackness. The 20th century ushered in fresh philosophies, novel medical procedures, and unprecedented breeds of systematic cruelty. These human storehouses quickly became significantly more sinister. Chapter 4 explores forced inmate labor between 1870 and 1930. Lurking behind every massive American mental institution was an agricultural empire, never just a simple backyard plot. Massive farming machines swallowed hundreds of acres, utilizing cattle, fruit trees, and glasshouses. This land nourished the captured residents. Harvests flooded local grocers, while funneling enormous wealth directly into government pockets. The laborers were the captives themselves. Institutional directors disguised this physical exploitation as rehabilitation. Labor was restorative. Labor was righteous. Labor shackled wandering minds. Such twisted logic survived earlier psychiatric eras, eventually building the dark financial bedrock of these sprawling medical compounds. Captives confined within Virginia at Central State Hospital bled into the exact soil of the old Mayfield plantation. Bound by circumstance, they harvested fields of peanuts, wheat, radishes, pumpkins, okra, fresh watermelons, and green alfalfa. Inmates managed large turkey flocks and guarded grazing cows. They churned out dairy for the wards and commercial buyers. Deep inside Ohio at Athens State Hospital, the mentally fragile ran a flawless, massive, and entirely self-sustaining farming empire. An initial 141 acres aggressively swallowed 1,000 more. 78 colossal brick structures slowly devoured the landscape. The forgotten souls plowed dirt, pruned fruit trees, sweated inside glass houses, and manufactured cheese. The sheer volume was staggering. By 1928, a massive new milking facility transformed the Athens compound into a totally independent food factory. Residents performed every grueling task, from extracting milk and whipping butter, to reaping grain and repairing heavy iron machinery. This madhouse functioned exactly like an isolated village, completely powered by the sweat of its captives. Compensation never existed. $0 entered their pockets. They possessed zero autonomy over their daily orders. Defiance guaranteed swift, brutal, physical retaliation. Toiling was compulsory, violently overseen by cruel guards demanding absolute obedience. The monetary gain for the state proved enormous. Government ledgers quietly reveal how these captive gardens printed hundreds of thousands of dollars in harvest profits every year. This bloody revenue directly erased the financial burden of housing the unwanted. It painted the hospitals as brilliantly frugal, secretly inspiring greedy wardens to lock away countless innocent citizens. Extra bodies equaled extra hands. More hands generated higher yields. Higher yields generated immense profits. It was a vicious, unbreakable cycle of human greed. Institutions mutated and grew, not to heal the broken mind, but to vastly multiply their lucrative commercial farming empires. The cruel shadow of racial prejudice felt overwhelmingly suffocating within the walls of racially divided medical compounds. Deep in Central State, Black captives bled into the exact soil of a brutal pre-Civil War cotton plantation. Only the vegetation varied. The sinister hierarchy survived untouched. Black men broke their backs, while wealthy white overseers hoarded the massive profits. Sweaty industrial workshops quickly dragged this forced servitude far beyond the muddy borders of the crop fields. Inside Central State, voiceless inmates ran busy lumber yards, cobbled leather boots, and mass-produced cheap brooms and straw beds. Wards consumed these goods, while administrators hawked the rest to outside buyers. They cynically labeled this enslavement as healing. The boundary separating genuine medical rehabilitation from outright slavery was dangerously invisible. Purposeful tasks might heal a fractured mind. However, violently forced, unpaid drudgery solely enriching the captors becomes pure, unadulterated evil. Female captives received equally grim, gendered sentences. Boiling massive vats of dirty linens dominated every single hospital basement. Endless, rotting mountains of soiled garments and damp blankets demanded ceaseless scrubbing, wringing, drying, and meticulous organizing. This grueling nightmare crushed the women entirely. It broke their spines. It numbed their brains while saving the state a fortune. Massive textile sweatshops chained vulnerable women to needles, forcing them to stitch thousands of identical inmate uniforms. Culinary details forced the weak to cook for thousands of ravenous mouths. Silent janitorial squads scrubbed the endless, terrifying corridors. Not a single penny ever reached their bleeding hands. This twisted hospital economy birthed deeply sick, predatory motives. Corrupt directors craved strong, compliant bodies. They completely ignored the genuinely ill who actually desperately needed profound psychiatric help. Intake procedures aggressively targeted physically robust victims capable of feeding the insatiable industrial machine inside the gates. Release boards deliberately trapped highly profitable laborers behind bars long after they regained their sanity. This monstrous machine thrived for decades. Even into the 1950s, captive sweat fueled the entire horrific system. Over its Central State, the plantation still roared. In Athens, the forgotten inmates endlessly manicured the haunting lawns and patched the decaying brick walls. This empire finally crumbled only when mass releases starved the fields of the warm bodies required to reap the harvest. Today, scholars try to measure the immense wealth drained from the backs of confined individuals. The records remain fragmented, yet projections indicate these captives generated millions of dollars through forced toil throughout the existence of these dark facilities. Vast fortunes moved from broken souls directly to government treasuries, entirely devoid of payment or permission. Silent graveyards whisper this tragedy. At Athens, almost 2,000 inmates lie hidden across 3 property burial plots. Until 1943, mere digits identified the vast majority of these tombs. Deep shame usually kept relatives from retrieving their dead. Those same individuals who bled to construct and run these compounds ultimately vanished into nameless dirt. At Central State, digging experts discovered over 4,000 hidden graves in a forgotten plot utilized from 1884 until 1924. The vast majority belonged to captives who perished inside those walls. Their sweat built empires. Their passing left nothing. Nobody ever exposed the true nature of this systemic exploitation. Administrators preached about healing and recovery. They kept completely silent about abuse and massive financial gain. The silenced victims possessed no platform to speak. Dusty ledgers concealed the grim reality behind sterile medical jargon and dry financial logs. That financial backbone dictated every single aspect of the psychiatric regime. It decided exactly who entered and who finally left. It steered the daily treatment of the confined. It birthed corporate greed that actively warred against human survival. Furthermore, it drained massive worth from victims entirely stripped of their right to fight back. Chapter 5. Skin Color and Profiling from 1870 through 1940. Central State Hospital entry logs whisper a chilling narrative that cold data utterly fails to convey. Every single arriving soul received a tag noting identity, years lived, daily trade, and home region. They recorded the medical label, and crucially, the alleged trigger behind their psychological fracture. Those documented triggers expose the deep prejudice warping American medicine. Among the logged catalysts for lockup were liberation, abolition, and the supposed failure of minorities to handle independence. That phrasing was never poetic. It served as rigid clinical categorization. Physicians truly held the conviction that shifting from bondage to independence sparked total psychological collapse within the minority population. Those practitioners cemented that twisted logic into clinical dossiers that still exist right now. Dr. King Davis, an ex-director of Virginia Psychiatric Care, spearheaded an effort to salvage and scan over 800,000 sheets of Central State archives. His discoveries were deeply chilling. Intake dossiers reveal that roughly 75% of minority inmates were slapped with labels of profound psychiatric deterioration, delusions, split minds, and uncontrollable frenzy. That staggering proportion towers above every other demographic on Earth. Scientifically, it makes absolutely zero sense. Our neurological makeup simply cannot fluctuate that wildly based on genetics. A much darker force was at play. Davis and his investigators finally reached a grim verdict. Most of those medical judgments were utterly false. Victims found themselves branded as incurably insane when they merely battled entirely different hardships. Deep emotional shock, crushing sorrow, extreme destitution, and bodily sickness were brutally mislabeled as psychiatric decay. These profiling trends mirrored the deep prejudice baked directly into clinical training and application. Caucasian physicians actively anticipated worse psychological fractures in their minority wards. They twisted entirely natural reactions to profound suffering and starvation into absolute proof of incurable madness. They stamped down medical tags that guaranteed permanent lockup. The archived logs display specific, terrifying instances. Consider Warren County local Walton Campbell, a 36-year-old domestic worker. Guards dragged him inside during July 1874 just for showing intense fear after spiritual arousal. 62-year-old George Burton from Pennsylvania County faced the same. Authorities detained him in September 1874 because he suffered paranoid visions of woodland trees transforming into armed soldiers aiming rifles directly at his chest. Those terrifying accounts read exactly like post-shock survival. The torment Burton endured matches what modern science terms post-traumatic stress disorder. Those specific individuals trapped inside Central State had literally lived through human bondage. They had watched brutal bloodshed. They had watched loved ones ripped away forever. They were navigating the most violently chaotic era in the nation. But doctors refused to see these reactions as psychological shock. They wrongly framed the suffering as inherent genetic traits. They framed this as proof that minorities could not handle independence, creating a flawless excuse for permanent state control. That chilling imbalance in medical profiling carried on for decades. Research from the 1920s and 30s highlights the exact same grim trajectory. Minority inmates inside Central State continuously received much heavier, far more devastating classifications than Caucasian inmates held at other Virginia compounds. Identical mental anguish triggered completely different medical verdicts, hinging entirely upon the color of the victim's skin. Modern investigations fully validate what Davis feared. Men of color are still disproportionately labeled as schizophrenic, compared to Caucasian peers exhibiting the exact same pain. The dark legacy forged within the walls of Central State still haunts our modern world. Institutional directors documented their captives with words that exposed a chilling prejudice. Dr. William Drury ruled over Central State for 28 long years. He authored chilling papers declaring that freedom triggered widespread madness among black citizens. He blamed the weight of liberty and the collapse of plantation order, diagnosing an imaginary weakness in the black mind. These twisted theories were absolutely mainstream. Drury commanded the American Medical Psychological Association, the powerful precursor to modern psychiatric authorities. His toxic beliefs mirrored mainstream medicine. They dictated the cruel treatment of black individuals from coast to coast. The map of committed inmates exposes a deeply sinister racial design. Captives were primarily extracted from dense black communities. They vanished from Richmond, Petersburg, Norfolk, and the surrounding rural shadows. These vibrant neighborhoods represented hard-won independence following emancipation. Yet these independent strongholds terrified white authorities. Locking someone in an asylum became a ruthless weapon for social dominance. No crimes were necessary. No juries were convened. A single judge could erase a life based on mere whispers from frightened neighbors or relatives. The rules were terrifyingly blurred. The victims possessed absolutely no legal armor. Powerless black families could only watch as the state swallowed their loved ones whole. They stood entirely alone. They possessed zero legal defense. They confronted a merciless machine built by white hands, fueled by white supremacy, and governed by deadly racial prejudice. Dusty archives now expose a horrific era of psychiatric segregation. It was a shadow medical system engineered to enforce racial subjugation. Black citizens were exiled to segregated nightmare facilities. They endured appallingly substandard treatment. They faced wildly biased evaluations. Doctors weaponized identical symptoms to brand them with far more devastating diagnoses. This grim past matters because its deep scars remain. The biased evaluations forged at Central State poisoned medical textbooks for decades. These toxic prejudices infected everyday clinical care. They dictated scientific funding and twisted therapeutic methods entirely. They engineered racial disparities that still poison modern medicine. Dr. Sean Utze from Virginia Commonwealth University released a chilling documentary exposing Central State in 2022. His work reveals how authorities caged black bodies under the guise of healthcare. He discovered an environment resembling a bleak warehouse rather than a sanctuary of healing. The salvaged historical records now fuel a desperate quest. Grieving families comb through the files to locate loved ones swallowed by the asylum. Scholars heavily utilize these files to document the grim reality. They expose the legacy of weaponized psychiatry, while activists demand brutal accountability. This dark saga of psychiatric racism is no forgotten relic. It remains a bleeding, breathing memory. It corrupts modern medicine and demands relentless scrutiny. Chapter 6 exposes the horrific experimental era spanning 1920 to 1960. The 1920s unleashed dangerous new ideologies across American mental health care. The gentle promise of moral healing was dead. The massive old asylums were now rotting. Overflowing human warehouses. Desperate physicians hungered for violent, rapid solutions. They ultimately targeted the fragile human body. They branded this nightmare somatic therapy. The underlying philosophy was brutally simple. They believed madness festered purely inside the brain. Alter the physical brain, and you obliterate the disease. This cold logic unlocked the gates to unparalleled medical savagery. The horrors of hydrotherapy arrived first. Victims were plunged into torturous baths of agonizing extremes. Freezing water shocked their fragile nerves, while scalding heat scorched their skin. These sessions were sheer violence. Captives thrashed and howled. Guards pinned them down mercilessly until the brutal timer expired. Virginia officials installed these barbaric water tubs on the main floor of Central State during 1925. Administrators paraded this machinery as a clinical triumph. In dark reality, it was pure physical torture, masked by clinical jargon. The cold sheet wrap served as another weapon. Captives were bound tightly in freezing linen and abandoned for agonizing hours. Doctors claimed the freezing restraints would soothe chaotic minds. In truth, terrified victims were left paralyzed and suffering. Many succumbed to hypothermia. Flesh decayed. Several victims ultimately perished. The nightmare of electroshock emerged in the 1930s. Physicians realized that triggering violent seizures could artificially rewrite human behavior. They strapped metal nodes to skulls and blasted the brain with devastating electrical currents. The ensuing spasms tore through them with such ferocity that bones simply snapped. During those early days, this brutal ordeal was inflicted without a single drop of anesthetic. Victims stayed fully awake when the raw current struck. They felt every agonizing spark. They remembered it all. Countless minds were left with permanent voids. Whole decades vanished into the dark, leaving them entirely disconnected from their own pasts. Across every solitary asylum, electroshock became a grim routine. It cost nothing. It was mercilessly fast. It yielded stark visual shifts, however fleeting. Restless souls were beaten into hollow obedience. The profoundly sorrowful occasionally emerged from the dark. Ignorance regarding the science never hindered the cruelty. They lacked understanding, yet eagerly embraced the torture. Yet the absolute darkest nightmare was still approaching. This was the lobotomy. The surgical horror emerged in Portugal in 1935, pioneered by a neurologist named Moniz. He coldly speculated that butchering delicate frontal lobe pathways might miraculously silence the madness. Those initial victims appeared remarkably subdued. By 1949, this mutilation earned him a Nobel Prize. American physicians seized the surgery with rabid hunger. Nobody championed this butchery like Dr. Walter Freeman, a neurologist prowling the wards of Washington District of Columbia. Freeman developed a sick obsession. He preached that mutilation was the ultimate psychiatric salvation. He stripped the surgery down to a barbaric minimum. It became a rapid, cheap slaughter requiring no sterile theater. They christened this nightmare the transorbital lobotomy. For his weapon, Freeman wielded a crude ice pick known as a leucotome. He drove the cold steel directly through the fragile socket above the eye. A gentle tap from a tiny mallet shattered the paper-thin bone. Once deep inside the skull, he violently scraped the metal side to side, blindly shredding the essence of humanity. The entire mutilation was over in under 10 minutes. It demanded zero general anesthetic. Freeman utilized brutal electroshock to force total unconsciousness. He butchered minds in private offices, in crowded wards, or upon any flat table he could find. Freeman roamed the entire nation, eagerly turning his horror into a traveling spectacle. He infiltrated desolate state facilities across Virginia, Ohio, and West Virginia. He eagerly trained other physicians. Thousands of minds were completely destroyed by his hands. He documented every single tragedy. Throughout the 1950s, Freeman treated the Athens Asylum as his annual hunting ground. Within those isolated walls alone, he executed over 200 lobotomies. During his most frantic days, he slaughtered 15 to 25 souls. Dr. Wolfhard Baumgartel stood as a staff physician at Athens in 1954. He witnessed the butcher at work. Decades later, the haunting memory spilled out. One victim exited. The next body arrived, a grotesque factory line of human flesh. Freeman stood completely relaxed. He performed the atrocity with effortless grace. The aftermath was utterly catastrophic. Between 2 and 5% of these vulnerable people died. Those who survived awoke as permanently hollowed entities. They drifted into permanent apathy. Focus evaporated completely. Their inner fire was extinguished, their true personalities totally erased. Grown adults were reduced to infants, requiring lessons in survival. They had to relearn eating, using the toilet, and dressing themselves. The procedure never healed the fractured mind. It merely obliterated the capacity to think deeply or feel. It reduced vibrant individuals into lingering, silent ghosts. Freeman drove his last spike at Athens in 1960. It was his final victim. His bloody spectacles finally sparked outrage. The medical world cast cold suspicion upon his methods. Emerging chemical restraints offered a bloodless alternative, yet the horror was already entrenched. Tens of thousands of Americans were permanently mutilated. The overwhelming majority were women. Countless others were silenced minorities. Many were merely inconvenient souls, betrayed by relatives who desired a docile, quiet burden. Deep within Central State Hospital in Virginia, the bloody ledgers remained deliberately vague. Yet that shadowed facility enthusiastically fueled the exact same dark machinery. Inmates were subjected to the ice pick, electroshock, and forced water therapies. They possessed absolutely no power to refuse. They lacked a single savior. This dark age of human trials laid bare the wicked heart of the asylum system. The afflicted were never respected as citizens. They were viewed merely as captive flesh, destined for brutal manipulation. Bizarre medical hypotheses were carved into flesh without permission. Failed methods were instantly swapped for new, reckless nightmares. The 1950s represented the absolute apex of this cruelty. Institutional populations exploded. Central State imprisoned over 4,800 souls. Athens held over 1,800. Greystone Park in New Jersey stood as a colossal monolith, bursting at the seams with the desperate and the damned. Then, the earth shifted. A potent chemical class called phenothiazine suddenly emerged. Thorazine, the pioneering chemical restraint, received federal blessing in 1954. For the first time, physicians possessed a weapon to tame madness without relying on the blade or electric shock. The pharmaceutical dawn had broken. The ice pick faded rapidly. By 1960, the surgical nightmare was a vanishing oddity. By 1970, the practice was thrown into the graveyard of history. Yet the countless victims remained trapped in reality, forever scarred and hopelessly diminished. This stands as chilling evidence of medical power left completely unchecked. Chapter 7 explores the dark eugenics movement and its forced sterilizations, spanning from 1924 through 1979. Spring arrived on March 20th, 1924, when Virginia Governor E. Lee Trinkle enacted Senate Bill 281. This terrifying Eugenical Sterilization Act granted state facilities absolute power to surgically alter anyone branded genetically unworthy. It stood as arguably the most ruthless biological mandate across the nation. The philosophical foundation remained beautifully simple and utterly savage. Certain human beings were deemed biologically defective, meaning their bloodlines had to be permanently severed. Mutilating these individuals ensured their perceived flaws perished in the grave. The grand illusion was a perfected society through human cultivation. Enter Harry Laughlin, the cold architect leading the eugenics record office in New York. He engineered a blueprint for this atrocity back in 1922. Virginia copied his dark masterpiece almost verbatim, greenlighting surgical interventions across 5 regional asylums. These nightmare factories included Western State Hospital in Stratton, Eastern State Hospital situated in Williamsburg, and Southwestern State Hospital in Marion. The tragic list continued with Central State Hospital in Petersburg, alongside the Lynchburg colony for epileptics and the supposedly feeble-minded. The surgical horrors commenced without delay. Administrators began pointing fingers at any ward they labeled biologically flawed. Paperwork flooded the internal review committees. A mere 30 days later, the scalpels would fall. Victims could beg for mercy, though their pleas predictably fell on deaf ears. Physicians wielding the blades enjoyed total legal immunity. Their absolute favorite prey were vulnerable women. Females endured forced tubal ligations, where doctors brutally severed their reproductive pathways. Male captives suffered mandatory vasectomies, a permanent cutting of the vas deferens. The mutilations were entirely irreversible. The victims never truly agreed to the butcher's knife, and soon enough, legal scholars challenged the very constitutional foundation of this cruelty. The defining judicial battle that ascended to the Supreme Court centered upon a tragic young soul named Carrie Buck. Authorities locked her inside the Lynchburg compound at just 17 years old. Her own mother was already rotting within those exact same walls. Prior to her incarceration, Carrie had brought an innocent infant girl into the world. Albert Pry, the cold-blooded superintendent of the Lynchburg facility, handpicked Carrie as his ultimate sacrificial pawn. He viciously argued that she embodied 3 consecutive generations of broken humanity: the mother, the patient, and her helpless baby. A supreme victory here would permanently legitimize his horrors. Judgment Day fell on May 2, 1927, when the United States Supreme Court sided with Virginia in a devastating 8-1 verdict. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes penned the majority ruling. His concluding sentence remains a historic abomination. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. This catastrophic ruling unleashed a dark, unstoppable tide. From 1924 until 1979, Virginia surgically violated more than 7,500 innocent citizens. The Lynchburg colony led this macabre crusade, mutilating over 2,700 victims alone. Western State Hospital closely trailed behind, defiling roughly 1,700 defenseless souls. Meanwhile, inside Central State Hospital, surgeons sterilized around 1,700 wards from 1924 to 1973. Missing archives intentionally obscure the final body count, yet the massive scale of destruction is undeniable. Innumerable black patients were biologically robbed of their future lineage. The insidious stench of racial engineering hung thickly in the air. Pseudoscience maliciously claimed that black individuals carried inferior bloodlines compared to their white counterparts. Mutilating these vulnerable citizens supposedly purified the broader genetic reservoir. Down at Central State, an entirely black asylum until 1967, absolutely every captive slept with a target on their back. The official justifications for these mutilations remained terrifyingly elusive and completely arbitrary. Diagnoses ranged from moral degeneracy and inherited madness to simple epilepsy. Such shadowy labels handed absolute, godlike power to the diagnosticians. A single nod from an administrator could condemn any societal outcast to the operating table. Complete destitution usually served as the true, unwritten death sentence for one's bloodline. Countless victims went under the knife, not for battling mental illness, but simply for being impoverished. They were born into families completely devoid of money or influence. No saviors existed to champion their cause. They were merely the weakest prey caught in a brutal machine built to exterminate society's unwanted. The relentless sound of scalpels echoed through those corridors for decades, long after science laughed off these genetic falsehoods, and long after the Nazis exposed the horrific endgame of racial purity. America stubbornly continued sterilizing its own citizens. Virginia finally struck the draconian law from the books in 1974. Tragically, the shadow of the scalpel lingered on much longer. A stubborn wave of surgical atrocities silently persisted inside the Lynchburg Training School all the way until 1979. This commonwealth dragged out its biological warfare longer than any other territory nationwide. Finally, in 1980, a relentless investigative reporter dragged the monumental horror into the light. The resulting public fury was absolute. Backed by the American Civil Liberties Union, 4 courageous survivors launched a monumental class-action legal strike. These warriors demanded the state track down every violated citizen and fully fund their medical reversals. While justice eventually prevailed in court, the horrific physical destruction inflicted upon those victims remained permanent. For their entire adult lives, these individuals walked the earth barren. Most never uncovered the dark reason. Surgeons whispered lies about infected appendixes and urgent medical needs. The chilling truth remained buried, deep within institutional shadows. In 2001, the Virginia General Assembly finally issued a formal apology for the horrific eugenics initiative. In 2015, lawmakers established a restitution fund. Surviving victims could claim $25,000 maximum. This hollow gesture felt entirely symbolic. Blood money could never replace stolen fertility, nor resurrect the unborn. Money never erases the deep trauma of bodily violation. Central State Hospital maintained a stony silence regarding their eugenics atrocities. Corridors remained open. The damning files stayed locked. These broken souls simply faded into oblivion. Today, their sterilization files rest within the haunting archives rescued by Dr. King Davis. These brittle pages expose one of the most calculated human rights atrocities committed within American medical history. They reveal the terrifying ease with which clinical authority becomes a weapon against the weak. They remind us this nightmare remains modern. Some victims still breathe today. Chapter 8 explores patients who became legends between 1956 and 1988. The asylum machines swallowed thousands of nameless souls. Yet some achieved notoriety. Their tales entirely captured the public consciousness. They permanently altered the American perception of psychiatric disease. They dragged buried institutional secrets into the harsh light. Woody Guthrie entered New Jersey Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital during 1956. He was exactly 44 years old. He existed as a living legend. Masterpieces like "This Land Is Your Land" were sacred anthems. However, Huntington disease aggressively devoured his mind. Greystone loomed as the most massive single-structure facility in the country. The compound covered 730 acres in Morris Plains. At its peak, it caged 7,000 captive patients. Woody Guthrie entered Ward 40. His mind and body crumbled. The merciless disease triggered violent tremors, mental decay, and psychiatric breaks. Doctors offered 0 treatments. Medicine provided 0 cures. The legendary artist simply waited for death. His bleak room became a sanctuary. Fellow musicians came visiting. Icons like Pete Seeger, Rambling Jack Elliott, and a Minnesota runaway named Bob Dylan appeared. Dylan pilgrimaged there repeatedly from 1961 until 1963. The young protege sat beside Guthrie. He played mournful chords. He absorbed genius from the dying master. These haunting encounters permanently scarred the early music of Dylan, anchoring him to a raw, acoustic tradition he would ultimately revolutionize. Death claimed Guthrie at Creedmoor State Hospital in New York on October 3, 1967. He spent his final 10 years locked inside facilities, yet his profound music outlived the madness. The grim tragedy of his confinement only fueled his enduring mythical status. Another inmate earned infamy for sinister reasons. Police dragged Billy Milligan into an Ohio precinct during October 1977. The suspect was 22 years old. Detectives charged him with kidnapping and assaulting 3 women on the Ohio State University campus. The case appeared straightforward, yet psychiatric evaluation unearthed an unprecedented horror. Milligan harbored severely fractured, multiple personality identities. Psychiatrists isolated 10 totally separate personas possessing his form. Eventually, they uncovered 14 additional fragments, totaling 24 fractured personalities. Each fragment possessed unique names and traits. Arthur was a British scholar. Rogan emerged as a violent Serbian enforcer. Adelana was a 19-year-old female who orchestrated the assaults. Billy, the core identity, swore he slept through the crimes. On December 4th, 1978, a historic shift occurred. Milligan stood completely exonerated, becoming the first American to beat felony violence charges using a multiple personality disorder defense. The shocking verdict paralyzed the nation with fear. Authorities banished Milligan to the Athens Mental Health Center in Ohio for targeted psychiatric treatment. This facility was the exact slaughterhouse where Dr. Walter Freeman executed over 200 lobotomies decades prior. Psychiatrist David Call initiated fusion therapy, battling to merge Milligan into one mind. The desperate treatment partially succeeded. A combined super identity named the Teacher suddenly emerged. When newspapers exposed Milligan receiving unmonitored leaves, civic fury exploded. The Teacher rapidly disintegrated. The lethal personas returned. By 1980, officials exiled Milligan to Lima State Hospital for the criminally insane. Internal conditions were brutal. Terrified inmates accurately labeled the bloody facility a literal chamber of horrors. His mind deteriorated. He escaped in 1986, living for 139 days as Christopher Carr. During that dark window, his roommate was murdered. Prosecutors never charged Milligan, though deadly suspicion haunted him forever. Authorities recaptured him, declaring his mind fused by 1988. He walked free after 11 years behind asylum walls. He lived quietly in California until dying on December 12, 2014. Before passing, Milligan reportedly confessed to his niece. The man confessed to taking human lives. Investigators tied his name to a pair of cold cases. His terrifying reality birthed major cinematic thrillers like Split and Glass, alongside episodic streaming nightmares and dark documentaries. Yet the most chilling echo from that dark period revolves around a tragic woman. She remained institutionalized inside a massive Ohio asylum. The 53-year-old mother of three endured 2 marriages. When maternal loss struck, her mind fractured into absolute darkness. Delusion convinced the grieving daughter that her parent survived. She whispered daily secrets to a corpse. A desperate spouse abandoned her to psychiatric confinement. Physicians labeled her schizophrenic, yet wardens granted the quiet woman immense trust. Staff allowed the gentle woman to roam the sprawling campus. Orderlies regularly watched the patient linger upon high stairwells to greet strangers. On the 1st of December, 1978, during the exact month a notorious criminal arrived, the woman vanished. Desperate nurses scoured busy corridors. Law enforcement soon intervened. Searchers discovered her quarters completely trashed, with shredded sheets and tossed belongings, yet 0 clues explained her phantom exit. 42 agonizing days passed until the 12th of January, 1979, when a janitor shifted crates inside a forgotten, derelict wing. Ward N20 previously quarantined highly contagious disease carriers. That terrifying wing sat entirely abandoned. A sickening stench overwhelmed the laborer. Tracking the horrific scent, he approached a secured barrier. Beyond the heavy lock lay the missing woman. She had decomposed in total isolation for roughly 6 weeks. Stripped entirely bare, the corpse rested face up against the freezing cement. Both limbs remained tightly folded across her decaying ribs. Every garment sat meticulously stacked beside the glass. Medical examiners blamed cardiac arrest triggered by extreme hypothermia. 0 warmth existed within that forgotten corridor. Deep winter in the Midwest brings merciless frost. The desperate patient slowly turned to ice, utterly forsaken inside the rotting psychiatric ruins. What forced her into that tomb? Somebody engaged the deadbolt from outside. She surely wandered inside prior to the latch falling, sealing her doom. Screams for mercy dissolved into the cavernous, silent void. Her agonizing demise permanently scarred the very architecture. As morticians lifted the tragic remains, a chilling silhouette remained burned into the stone. The absolute shape of human suffering etched perfectly into the floorboards. Janitors applied water and harsh chemicals. Every attempt failed utterly. During 2007, university scientists examined the ghastly shadow. Decaying human flesh had generated a waxy chemical anomaly, burning a tragic portrait into stone. Industrial detergents had inadvertently baked the horrifying ghost forever into the solid stone. That horrific imprint haunts the abandoned property even now. It stands as a dark monument to one lonely soul and countless forgotten psychiatric victims. Chapter 9. A slow decay started around 1955 and lasted until 1996. Medical miracles arriving in 1954 tamed madness, replacing brutal lobotomies with chemical restraint. Violently disturbed inmates suddenly morphed into incredibly peaceful souls. Lifelong captives suddenly exhibited capabilities to survive alongside normal society. Medical releases finally became a tangible, miraculous reality. These chemical breakthroughs ignited an absolute systemic overhaul. The underlying philosophy felt straightforward. Severely traumatized minds required compassion rather than iron bars. Sufferers belonged inside loving domestic spheres. Clinicians proposed healing them openly among regular citizens. Former inmates could secure steady wages and raise children. Cavernous torture facilities became obsolete. National legislation accelerated this massive shift. 1963 brought crucial government legislation, pouring massive wealth into neighborhood psychological healing facilities. Historic medical programs launched during 1965 offered massive monetary rewards for emptying the archaic psychiatric dungeons. A brutal warehousing era rapidly disintegrated. Raw statistics paint a deeply tragic picture. During 1955, asylums caged 558,000 souls. Come 1980, populations plummeted to 138,000. 1995 saw fewer than 72,000 captives. One specific Virginia facility purged its massive 1950s census of 4,800 down below 300 toward 1985. Massive structures designed to contain multitudes suffered immediate, permanent shuttering. Corridors were entirely sealed shut. A terrifying hush blanketed the massive grounds. The dark Ohio compound mirrored this decline. 1950 censuses of 1,800 captives plummeted below 300 throughout the 1980s. The majestic architecture rotted, paint stripped away. Massive roofs surrendered. Wild nature ruthlessly conquered the hollow interior. Yet this liberation birthed a sinister nightmare. Captives secured sudden freedom, while essential neighborhood support networks remained hopelessly bankrupt. Countless shattered minds filled the freezing gutters. Law enforcement caged the rest. A broken psychiatric apparatus never truly evolved. Bureaucrats simply destroyed the foundation. Those unlucky few trapped behind locked asylum doors possessed the absolute darkest, most shattered minds. These tragic figures absolutely failed to navigate everyday society. Their broken realities demanded relentless, clockwork medical supervision, yet their massive concrete cages were rapidly imploding. Medical guardians vanished alongside the dwindling inmate numbers. Surviving inside became hellish. Central State operated within decaying masonry, erected during the 1880s. Sweltering heat suffocated the patients, while torrential rains turned broken wards into swamps. A devastating laundry blaze demanded $50,000 for restoration. Sick inmates endured relentless bus rides across 13 separate buildings just to receive basic treatments. Following a grim tour, State Senator Craig Deeds likened the nightmare to one flew over the cuckoo's nest. Meanwhile, Athens harbored equally dark horrors. Sustaining the colossal Kirkbride structure proved financially ruinous. Consequently, Cottage B, the former tuberculosis unit, devolved into a playground for morbid trespassers. Wrecking crews obliterated the site in 2013. Once the asbestos-poisoned ruins became too deadly to stand. Horrific scandals erupting throughout this dark era exposed deeply rooted institutional rot. Inside the notorious Letchworth Village in New York, investigative journalist Geraldo Rivera exposed the grim realities in 1972. Captured film revealed intellectually disabled youths sprawled naked on cold floors, abandoned in their own filth without a shred of human supervision. At New York's infamous Willowbrook State School, parallel nightmares violently clawed their way into daylight. More than 5,000 trapped souls, predominantly innocent youths, suffocated inside decaying walls built for 4,000. Hepatitis ravaged the wards. Brutality was daily law. The hellish compound rapidly mutated into a national monument to human cruelty. Such grim discoveries hastened the permanent shuttering of these asylums. Yet, closing doors never cured the festering societal wounds. Desperate populations demanding medical salvation remained utterly desperate. The haunting unknown shifted entirely to where and how true healing would manifest. Central State Hospital survived the purge, yet morphed completely. By 1967, its iron gates opened to all races, shattering 97 years of absolute segregation. The wandering faces transformed entirely. The core purpose fundamentally evolved. Throughout the 1990s, it housed exclusively forensic cases, guarding psychologically shattered individuals charged with severe crimes. Meanwhile, Athens State Hospital shut forever in 1993. The final inmates were banished to a sterile, compact compound across the city. The looming Kirkbride structure rotted in silence for years before Ohio University claimed the ruins. Presently, those blood-stained walls shelter the Kennedy Museum of Art, alongside mundane academic headquarters. Unsuspecting scholars now tread halls where broken minds once wept. Shuttering these colossal monuments never extinguished the agony. It merely displaced the sorrow. Destitute shelters overflowed with abandoned souls who previously required institutionalization. Concrete penitentiaries quietly mutated into de facto psychiatric holding cells. Hospital trauma centers drowned beneath rising tides of severe psychiatric breakdowns. Today's psychological support network stands utterly shattered and violently starved of capital. Local therapeutic havens remain tragically non-existent. Medical cots are devastatingly scarce. Desperate minds facing total collapse find zero salvation. The massive human warehouses vanished, yet the agonizing trauma they aimed to cage still bleeds. On the cursed grounds of Central State, workers broke ground in 2023 for a $400 million complex, boasting 252 clinical cots, sleek architecture, and ruthless surveillance networks. Government authorities boldly label the fortress a radiant beacon of hope. Those haunted, decaying monoliths face impending destruction. The sterile modern sanctuary targets a grand unveiling in 2026. The pristine fortress will obliterate brick walls that cast shadows for over 140 years. It must shelter a demographic altered beyond all recognition. This new endeavor promises to deliver genuine salvation in manners the ancient madhouse could never achieve. Yet the blood-soaked history refuses to die. The graveyards endure. The chilling files survive. The whispered nightmares linger. Central State stood as America's inaugural mental ward exclusively for Black citizens. The compound weathered the ashes of slavery, the horrors of Jim Crow, civil rights uprisings, and mass deinstitutionalization. The imposing structure silently observed 200 years of brutal American evolution from a uniquely bleak perspective. The massive holding pens are shutting forever, but the agonizing duty of exhuming memory just commenced. Chapter 10. A brutal legacy and total reckoning from the year 2000 to the present. The silent burial grounds whisper the final act of this asylum tragedy. Deep within Athens, nearly 2,000 discarded souls rot beneath the soil across 3 overgrown campus cemeteries for nearly 70 grueling years. Between 1874 and 1943, cruel numbers replaced identities. No names existed, nor dates recorded, leaving mere digits to identify the anonymous dead. Paralyzed by profound societal shame, relatives refused to retrieve the corpses. Psychological sickness wielded a devastating cultural stigma. Banishing bloodkin to a madhouse invited unspeakable public humiliation. Bloodlines consciously chose to watch their flesh and blood vanish into nameless dirt rather than admit biological ties to madness. Beneath the soil of Central State, the macabre reality proved infinitely darker. High-tech radar sweeps exposed a chilling truth, uncovering over 4,200 forgotten graves in a nameless cemetery active between 1884 and 1924. The death pits sit in unnervingly perfect rows. Every trench swallows one solitary corpse. The vast majority lack any memorial whatsoever. Archival digging unearthed a profoundly sinister discrepancy. The staggering volume of interred corpses completely contradicts the official death tolls logged by the institution across that dark era. A handful of corpses returned to grieving households. However, a horrifyingly massive surplus vanished directly into the hands of the Virginia State Anatomical Board. The discarded flesh fueled morbid academic dissections and calculated medical experimentation. Skeletons were carved up and shipped to universities statewide. Finally, in 1991, Virginia erected a solitary monument at Central State, memorializing the nameless shadows buried upon those haunted grounds. The solemn stone engraving declares it stands in remembrance of those forgotten persons who were served and buried here in the campus cemetery during the early years and are known only to God. Recently, a grim crusade to name these forgotten souls has rapidly gained momentum. The National Alliance on Mental Illness spearheaded a desperate reclamation campaign down at Athens. Cold numerical markers vanished into the earth, swapped for proper headstones whenever shattered identities were verified. Yearly vigils honor the fallen Civil War veterans buried there. One singular tragedy proves exactly why this dark work matters. Viola Rapp vanished into the Athens asylum during the early 20th century. Plagued by mental illness, she watched the state steal her children away. Her daughter, Dorothy, disappeared into a cold orphanage. Behind locked psychiatric doors, Viola contracted deadly tuberculosis. She perished in 1934, buried beneath a nameless, numbered stone. Her daughter was cruelly forbidden from attending the burial. For 66 agonizing years, Dorothy searched in vain for her mother's unmarked grave. Finally, investigators with the Ridges Cemeteries Project matched lost names to cold numbers. They tracked down descendants, revealing where stolen ancestors rested. In the year 2000, an elderly Dorothy finally stood beside that tragic grave. She held a quiet ceremony. She whispered goodbye. A proper monument displaying Viola's name replaced the cruel numbered stone. Preserving the dark, decaying archives became equally vital. At Central State, Dr. King Davis commanded a 10-year battle to salvage over 800,000 deteriorating pages. These brittle files rotted in conditions designed to obliterate history. Brutal summer temperatures inside those dark vaults exceeded 112 degrees. Virginia law mandated the destruction of any psychiatric file over 10 years old. Defying oblivion, Davis and his team digitized everything. They bravely digitized admission records, dark treatment logs, annual reports, board minutes, and haunting photographs. This chilling collection stands as the absolute most comprehensive archive of Black mental health admissions in American history. These surviving documents serve multiple profound purposes. Horrified scholars analyze them to expose the dark, brutal history of racist psychiatry. Advocates weaponize them to expose institutional violence. Desperate families scour them to find lost ancestors swallowed by the cruel asylum system. A harrowing documentary, crafted by Dr. Shah Utsi in 2022, finally dragged this nightmare into the public eye. The film, titled The Central Lunatic Asylum for the Colored Insane, debuted at the Africana Film Festival in Richmond. It screened at the American Psychiatric Association headquarters in Washington. It unearthed chilling narratives buried in silence for over 1 century. Yet this bloody legacy remains alive today. On March 6, 2023, a 28-year-old black man named Ervo Oteno perished at Central State Hospital. He was spiraling into a severe mental health crisis. He was trapped in the custody of Henrio County Sheriff's deputies. Chilling surveillance footage captured Oteno violently pinned to a cold admissions room floor for over 11 agonizing minutes. 7 heavy deputies and 3 hospital workers crushed his body. Handcuffed and shackled in iron, he tragically stopped breathing. Desperate, frantic attempts to revive him completely failed. The medical examiner officially ruled his brutal death a homicide. The grim cause was positional and mechanical asphyxia via restraints. 10 individuals were initially charged with second-degree murder. Those severe charges were ultimately reduced or quietly dropped. 1 hospital worker walked free. His devastated family received an $8.5 million settlement. Oteniano's brutal demise proved that Central State's dark reign of institutional violence was far from finished. The decaying buildings may be crumbling to dust. A new facility rises, yet the sinister patterns of control, neglect, and absolute harm persist. His grieving mother, Caroline Uko, addressed the court after the devastating verdict. "My son was drowning in a terrible mental health crisis." This painful verdict vividly demonstrates that broken souls experiencing a severe mental crisis like my son possess absolutely no protection under the law. The American Psychiatric Association has finally acknowledged this blood-stained history. They hosted a grim exhibition regarding Central State inside their headquarters. They awarded Dr. King Davis their prestigious Benjamin Rush Award for his tireless preservation work. They are merely beginning to confront the deeply racist foundations of their profession. Yet a simple reckoning is never the same as true repair. The horrific disparities documented during the 19th century violently persist today. Black Americans remain disproportionately overdiagnosed with severe psychological conditions. They still suffer under inferior medical care. They still encounter brutal discrimination throughout the mental health system. The tragic human warehouses are finally closing. Central State's brand new psychiatric facility will open soon. The imposing Kirkbride buildings at Athens now hold museums and corporate offices. Greystone Park was partially demolished in 2015, despite desperate preservation efforts. Letchworth Village lies completely abandoned and slowly crumbling. Yet the tragic souls who suffered inside these institutions left indelible marks behind. Their presence lingers within cold, numbered graves, buried archives, and dark stains that will never wash away. Their hidden stories demand to be told. Their immense suffering demands eternal remembrance. Their stolen humanity demands to be fiercely acknowledged. This remains the haunting, blood-stained legacy of the American asylum system. A 200-year experiment in institutional care utterly destroyed the vulnerable people it was supposed to help. This dark network of human warehouses promised healing, but only delivered irreversible harm. This dark history is something America is only beginning to confront. We have traversed 200 years of blood-soaked American psychiatric history. The shadow stretches from 1773 Williamsburg to the massive Central State Complex, opening in 2026. The bloodline runs from the rotting timber shacks of Howard's Grove to the $400 million fortress rising today. We stared into the eyes of physicians who genuinely thought they were saviors. Thomas Story Kirkbride offered grand architecture, while Walter Freeman brought cold industrial efficiency, hammering ice picks into skulls. Then stood William Francis Drury, whose twisted philosophies warped healing through dark racial supremacy. We witnessed the confined agony, like a 14-year-old girl locked away because her parents believed demons owned her. Men were caged for private habits, while women were banished simply for aging. Black citizens were chained under the grotesque lie that freedom drove them mad, facing pure horror disguised as care. Boiling baths served as liquid torture, while violent electrical currents burned away their precious memories. Brain mutilations butchered souls, and forced sterilizations wiped entire bloodlines away, leaving us wandering among nearly 2,000 silent graves at Athens. Over 4,000 bodies rot at Central State. Nameless stones bear cold digits instead of identities. Abandoned by families, paralyzed by shame, leaving a profoundly dark inheritance. The curse persisted when Irvo Otieno died on Central State floors in 2023, exposing glaring racial divides. A broken machine continues chewing up the vulnerable, exposing an American psychiatric empire built entirely upon dark contradictions. It whispered promises of salvation but delivered cages, weaponizing medicine to enforce societal compliance. It preached progressive reform while actively cementing systemic bigotry into the ground. The state grew rich off slave labor, stripping away basic humanity by design rather than mistake. This cruelty was the engine itself, carefully engineered to sweep undesirables off the public streets. The manic, the broke, the old, the crippled, and minorities were swept away simply for failing as perfect citizens. These human storage units did exactly their job by hiding the rejected and giving relatives an excuse to forget. Polite society pretended madness spared their pristine neighborhoods, while massive factories produced agony at an unfathomable rate. Hundreds of thousands of broken souls vanished into these massive facilities. Countless numbers never saw the sun again, expiring behind thick brick walls only to be dumped into anonymous dirt trenches. Their very humanity was stripped away. Yet the machine shifts, shutting decaying wards to erect modern replacements. Clinical methods shifted as daily pills replaced ice picks, and neighborhood care replaced massive fortresses. Yet shifting paint does not equal true justice, as victims broken by this grinding wheel have never received genuine recognition. Bloodlines, shattered by these disappearances, have never seen a single drop of true restitution. Targeted neighborhoods bleed from invisible wounds, even as Dr. King Davis spent 10 grueling years rescuing Central State archives. He preserved them because he believed those dark histories truly mattered. Every single black citizen diagnosed with madness was dragged here, leaving him to declare they held the desperate files of absolutely everyone. From penniless beggars to respected officials, they all rotted in those wards, making their surviving paperwork a critical tool today. Descendants use yellowed pages to locate kin, historians map the horror, and warriors hunt down the guilty. These documents force humanity to stare into the abyss of atrocities committed under the sacred banner of medical care. That haunting silhouette burned into the floorboards at Athens outright refuses to fade. Margaret Schilling's decaying corpse left an eternal shadow, and harsh chemicals meant to scrub her away merely baked her outline deeper. That permanent mark symbolizes a brutal psychiatric empire that carved inescapable scars. It forever scarred the captive victims, their grieving relatives, the heavily policed neighborhoods, and the complicit country that simply looked away. We possess no magic to reverse this cruelty, resurrect the slaughtered, or hand back those stolen decades. We lack the power to cure generational gashes, yet we hold a sacred duty to remember names and respect their silent graves. We must absorb dark lessons from yesterday and fight relentlessly so this pitch-black history never repeats its cycle. These monolithic tombs are finally crumbling, but trapped spirits demand recognition as human beings rather than mere ink on a ledger. They breathed, loved, and held on to fragile dreams, living lives that carried profound universal weight. Allow their nightmare to serve as our alarm bell, screaming for absolute change, because we owe it to their ghosts to build a kinder world.